There are very few people, even outside the world of cars, who won't stop and look at a Citroen DS. When Flaminio Bertoni's big saloon was unveiled in the mid-50s, it was like nothing else. 12,000 orders were placed in the first day the car was unveiled, 80,000 after 10 days of the Paris Motor Show. Not only were they stylistically beautiful, but technically as well. Citroen were owned by Michelin. Yes, that's right, the restaurant guide people. It may seem a little backwards to modern ears for a tyre company to own a car company, but it's like this. Citroen had gone bankrupt in the 1930s, and Michelin hadn't. We have much to be thankful for there, even aside from Michelin being technologically aggressive, resulting in greenlighting all sorts of technology to go into Citroen cars. The company really focused on development of the radial tyre, and designed all new post-war cars around it, paving the way for that superior technology to supersede the old cross-plies. The DS was no exception. The car also received a fully hydropneumatic self-leveling suspension system, aimed at reducing the harshness of post-war French roads, in much the way the 2CV had been before. This system had been applied to the rear axle of a few late-model traction Avants, but in the DS it would replace the springs on all four wheels. The car was the first mass-produced to use discs on the front wheels, at a time when even the 160-mile-an-hour Mercedes Gullwing had drums. In the Series 3 cars, the headlights followed the direction of the front wheels to improve safety at night. Only now are other car makers following suit, and even then they don't do it with nearly as much panache. The DS remained a popular car and a French icon throughout its 20-year production run. Its peak production year wasn't until 1970. All in all, about 1.5 million of these much-loved cars had been produced. By the early 70s, though undoubtedly still beautiful, the car's shortfalls were catching up with it. The engines were never a strong point. The traction Avant before had a nice smooth 6-cylinder option. The DS never got that. French tax brackets kept the engine options low in displacement, between 1.9 and 2.3 litres. And the pushrod 4-cylinder offer was always noted for being quite thrashy. The car struggled too in that land that all luxury car makers dream of breaking into. The American buyer in the 1960s would want a car that was large, air-conditioned and V8 powered. The DS was offered as none of those things. Even the car's legendary good looks were curtailed in the land of the free. American headlights all had to be fixed, sealed beams. This particularly affected the Series 3 DS, where the lovely covered headlamps and clever swiveling lights had to go. By the end of the 1960s, Citroen's management could see that the DS wasn't going to sell forever. There was also the question of a mid-range car, or lack thereof. At the cheap end of the range sat the 2CV and the AMI 6, then in the luxury segment sat the D-Series cars, with nothing in between. Long-term Citroen designer Flaminio Bertoni had passed away suddenly in 1964, and a young Robert Opron had been made head of the styling department. He went on to be responsible for the DS's Series 3 facelift in 1967. In overall charge of Citroen at this time was Pierre Berco. A great lover of art and culture, he gave the design department almost free rein, with nothing outlandish off the table. When it came to replace the DS, two models were proposed. A smaller car, in line with the Peugeot 504 and Renault 16, and a larger one for the luxury segment. Development of the smaller car began under the banner of Projet L. At this time, a small section of management felt it would be better commercially if Citroen were to abandon their eccentric designs in favour of something more conventional. Robert Opron disagreed, but he did what he was told. He had Jacques Chariton and Michael Harmont in his department design a car with altogether conventional appearance. Meanwhile, he also let his designers begin work on the car they wanted to build. Citroen under Berco didn't use public consultation in designing new models. All decisions were left to management inside. When it came time to unveil the new model to Berco & Co., Opron had both cars in the design studio under covers, with the conventional design in front and the designer's car behind a screen. He unveiled the conventional model first. The managers who wanted it were pleased. Berco said nothing. Opron led the group behind the screen and unveiled the other car. Berco's eyes lit up, and he exclaimed, "This is what we need." The dissenters were overruled, and Opron got to continue working on his car. André Barthélemy, in 1965, had begun work on a type of frame to which the car's suspension, engine and body could be attached. The result is a car which is a mix of monocoque and body-on-frame. It was trialled on a DS development mule and found to be very comfortable, owing to the fact that the engine and wheels are technically no longer connected to the body. It also increases strength. As Project L took shape, attention turned to options for engines. One early prototype was fitted with a 4-cylinder boxer of Lancia origin, possible at the time due to the partnership with Fiat, but this was found to have a centre of gravity too far forward, and at 1.6 litres was probably not big enough for the big car that Project L would turn into. In the background, Citroen released the SM and GS in 1970. The smaller GS had been developed under Project F and filled a gap in the lower segment of the market. In the end, it looked like a smaller version of the car that Project L would become. The SM had been developed under Project S to provide initially a sports coupe version of the DS. Eventually it became its own Grand Tourer design and made use of the fact that Citroen owned Maserati by using their V6 from the Merak. During the prototype stages, some Project L cars were fitted with the V6. However, the engine had never proven overly reliable in the SM, and in any case Maserati would go into liquidation under Citroen in 1975, so the engine would never have been a great long-term option. The Rotary engine was assumed to be the up-and-coming power plant of the future at this stage. On paper it is fantastic. Lots of power from not so much displacement, compact, quiet, vibration-free. Citroen had worked with NSU to develop a bi-rotor Wankel engine which would be fitted to the GS bi-rotor, fairly unsuccessfully. These engines simply weren't reliable enough, as Mercedes were finding out at the time with their C111 project. The partnership with Fiat ended in 1972 and left Citroen with no other option but to reuse the old D-series engines, which could trace their roots all the way back to 1933. In the background, Citroen was preparing to actually produce this new car. The company went all in. Too far in as it would transpire. A brand new factory at Aulnay-sous-Bois and all the associated tooling would be the straw that broke the company's back financially and land them in the arms of risk-averse Peugeot. By 1972, the final shape of the car, which would be the CX, was all but complete. Now it just needed a name. Of course, this would have to be something along the lines of a two-letter designation such as GS, DS or SM. Jacques Vogensinger came up with the French abbreviation for the coefficient of drag. In English, this would be CD, but in French, in fact, the earlier SM has the CX beat in terms of CX, with 0.33 compared to the latter's 0.36. That's not to say that the shape of the CX isn't incredibly ahead of its time. It's easy to forget now, but compare it to contemporary offerings. Even Mercedes was still releasing distinctly slab-fronted cars 2 years later. The final model bears more than a passing resemblance to a piece of work completed by Sergio Pininfarina back in the 1960s, and unveiled at the Turin Motor Show in '67. This car was a redesigned study for the Austin 1800. In the end, BMC weren't brave enough to put this car into production in the 1960s, but its incredibly aerodynamic shape and camtail certainly helped Opron finish his designs for both the GS and the CX, as well as Alfa Romeo's Alfa Sud, Lancia's Beta, and eventually Rover's SD1 in 1976. The CX design is nothing if not minimalist. There are two lines in the bodywork. The first here flows from the wing back to the front door, and a second higher up which flows down to meet the rear lights. The wheel arches on these early cars are smooth and simple. This is a nod to austerity, and the door handles are the same. They had some trouble with the windscreen. It was too big, huge by the standards of the day. The two wipers originally conceived couldn't clear the screen sufficiently. This was so much of an issue that a system for blowing rain off with compressed air was considered. Making the screen smaller was out of the question. It would ruin the lines of the car. The eventual solution was a simple one, as you can see. Your typical family motor car tends to have a lot of overhang at the back and not a lot at the front. You can see Citroen turned that on its head, with a lot at the front and not a lot at the rear. This is to emphasise front-wheel drive. The covered rear wheels are an effort in the same vein. The bright work on the CX isn't plated chrome, it's stainless steel. This was Berko's doing. He liked pure, real materials. Likewise, the concave rear window. Berko didn't like the hatchback door, he felt it was more appropriate for a van. The caved window has the added bonus of clearing rainwater without a wiper. If you think it's spaceship themed in here, that's no coincidence. Interior designer Michel Hammond was a big fan of science fiction. He also liked logical placement of instruments without care for convention, and as a result, a 70s Citroen tends to take getting used to. There are no stalks. Everything is within a finger's reach of the steering wheel, which of course is single spoked, so you can mostly always see the instruments. Lights are on the right. This lever switches them on. This rocker switch looks after the high beams, this button to flash. On the left we have everything else. Indicators on this rocker, wiper underneath, horn on this button. Drive this for a day and you'll wonder why every car isn't the same. This flying saucer cluster is called La Lunule, or crescent moon. In it are more warning lights than you can shake a stick at. And everyone's favourite, the rotating drum speedometer. The seats are deep, plush and comfortable, reminiscent of a DS. The door handles are shaped like the trigger of a gun. This cosmonaut helmet is supposed to be an ashtray, and between the seats we have the heater controls and the manual height adjustment. First and foremost, the CX is equipped with Citroen's by this point bread and butter hydropneumatic system. In the CX, this system provides adjustable self-leveling suspension for all four wheels. I could wax lyrical about the ride quality of this car, but instead I'll quote disgraced motoring journalist Jeremy Clarkson, who called this literally the best riding car ever made. There are no coil springs, and damping is provided by nitrogen-filled spheres at each wheel. A pump on the engine provides pressure to the system, which doesn't hold it while the car isn't running. So a Citroen of this vintage, which has been standing overnight, will usually have to be raised from the ground in the morning. It wasn't thought possible to produce automotive suspension which is capable of being comfortable in a straight line and handling well in the corners. The man who invented it, Paul Magès, had no technical training, and so was able to apply unconventional wisdom. The principle is simple. With increasing loads, the nitrogen gas pressure becomes higher, so you can have stiff suspension through the corners and soft on the straights. The system also feeds a true power braking system, much like the DSM and the DS, where the brake pedal is replaced by a mushroom. Although here, there was a step towards normality. The mushroom has a pedal hinged on top of it. The function remains the same, however. This is really more like an on-off switch, which sends high-pressure hydraulic fluid to the calipers. You'll find no vacuum booster in the engine bay, and the brakes are incredibly sharp. The third function to be fed from the car's hydraulic system is Douvrin steering when fitted. This is Citroen's proprietary power steering system, which was first seen in 1970, fitted to the DS and SM. Douvrin stands for Direction à Rappel Asservi, or power steering with power assisted return. In the UK it was marketed as VariPower, and in the US as Speedfeel. Also invented by Paul Magès, it was the first commercially available variable power steering, and it is mechanically fascinating. The first thing to know is that the steering wheel is not mechanically connected to the steering rack under normal operation. Where most steering setups are power assisted, this is a fully powered system. The driver's input directs a change in hydraulic pressure to move the steering left or right. The rack and pinion system itself is almost conventional, and should the hydraulic system fail, there will be enough manual control to safely stop the car, but the steering will be incredibly heavy. Constant hydraulic pressure keeps the system self-centered, and creates the phenomenon where the wheel will automatically return itself to the straight ahead position. The result is in theory steering without any kickback. Neither tyre blowouts nor potholes can affect the steering wheels or the steer direction since there simply is no feedback. It is all artificial. I'm told the DS and the SM were able to make better use of this with their inboard brakes allowing for a truly neutral steering geometry. When outboard brakes were installed on the CX, the geometry was thrown slightly. In practice, this is barely noticeable. The system takes getting used to and can feel far too sensitive at first. The failure of the Rotary program meant the CX launched with the 2 and 2.2 litre petrol engines found in the DS. Unlike in the DS, they were mounted transversely. In fact, you can see the engine sits well ahead of the front axles and is canted forward 30 degrees on top of that. This is to fit the engine under the low bonnet line. The gearbox is a product of the Fiat partnership. It's based on the gearbox of the Lancia Beta, and could be had as a 4-speed or even a 5-speed like this one. A 3-speed semi-automatic was marketed as C-Matic. The eagle-eyed among you will note that this isn't the aforementioned petrol lump. The 2.2 litre diesel was introduced in 1976 to complement the petrol offerings. The French are famously fond of heavy oil, but this will be the first Citroen car offering with one since before the war. The engine came from the C32 van. Unfortunately, the 2200 was a wee bit gutless, and in 1978 this 2.5 from the C35 van was added to the car range. Interestingly, these engines are gear driven, rather than by a timing belt or a timing chain. When it was sold in 1978, this 2500 diesel Palace with its 5-speed gearbox was the fastest diesel car on sale in Europe. On the petrol front, the 2.4 litre engine appeared in the CX Prestige of 1976. This was a car envisaged to replace the top-of-the-line DS23. The car gained 25 cm in its wheelbase over a standard CX, all of which went to the rear seat legroom. Long wheelbase CXs are easily recognisable by their vinyl roofs, which hide the weld seam where the extension was carried out. Early plans for the Prestige envisaged a sort of hybrid between CX and SM. This car would have had a completely redesigned interior too, but unfortunately it never materialised. Instead, the Prestige was for all intents a well-appointed long wheelbase CX. Peugeot's PSA group had acquired 38% of Citroën in 1974. By 1978, PSA increased their stake to 90%. This brought options for technology sharing, even if it threatened Citroën's individuality and flair with Peugeot's famously conservative design. One of these was the Douvrin engine, developed jointly by Peugeot and Renault. This was a belt-driven overhead camshaft engine, and much needed for the petrol CXs, which are still being built with those side-cam DS engines. These appeared in 1979 in the 2000 Reflex and Athena saloons. Speaking of long wheelbases, in September 1975 the CX brake was presented as a replacement for the DS brake, with the 8-seater Familiale arriving in 1976 to replace the DS Safari models. The car was an elegant solution, with rear doors redesigned to meet the new line of the large rear windows. The cars were fitted with reinforced rear suspension arms and a slightly wider track compared to the saloon. In 1977, Citroen introduced the CX GTi, with an emphasis on sportiness. To this end, the car had suspension spheres set up to provide less body roll through the corners. The 2.4 engine with the Boss fuel injection provided power. This had been seen on the DS23 injection, but that car used the early D-Jetronic system, while the CX got the more reliable L-Jetronic analog control system. Where D-Jet is controlled by manifold pressure, L-Jet is controlled by airflow via a vane. These 128 horsepower cars were distinguished by lots of matte black trim and badging, as well as special alloy wheels. The car was very nearly called the GT Injection Electronique, but at the last minute this reverted to GTI. The CX was gradually upgraded through the late 70s and into the early 80s, mainly with cosmetic changes. Front track width got slightly wider, necessitating small flares in the front arches. In 1983, badging changed from, for example, CX 2500 to just CX 25. Successive oil crises and Middle Eastern revolutions had made people more fuel conscious than ever. As early as 1979, a GTD model had been conceived as an economical alternative to the GTI, but the sporty diesel would have to wait until 1983, when diesel models were offered with a Garrett turbocharger. There was a lower spec CX 25 RD Turbo and a higher spec CX 25 TRD, which was sold in the UK as the DTR because they thought TRD was too similar to Turd. Toyota take note. By 1984, however, the now 10-year-old CX's sales were being eaten away, particularly by the Audi 100 and Renault 25. The latter had even been penned by Opron, who left Citroën over the Peugeot buyout. The answer? A mild facelift, of course. The C in PSA stands for Citroën after all. In late 1984, the CX GTi Turbo was presented at the Paris Auto Show. A 40% increase over the naturally aspirated GTI, with a top speed of 220 km an hour or 136 miles per hour. The engine block had been redesigned to take the turbo, along with some other performance components such as thicker anti-roll bars. The gauge cluster was a taste of what was to come. Gone were the rolling drums, replaced with a conventional cluster. Ad agency RSCG were tasked to create a campaign for the GTi Turbo. Jean-Paul Goude was going out with Grace Jones at the time, and came up with the idea of using Grace in the Citroen advertising. Posters of Jones with a CX-shaped haircut popped up all over France, with the top speed of 220 km per hour in large letters. France's transport minister was apparently unimpressed, and thought it encouraged people to break the speed limit. The resulting media attention was great publicity, and caused a flurry of reviews to the GTi Turbo. While theoretically only a mild cosmetic facelift, CX2 managed to radically alter the character of the car. Stainless trim and bumpers were eradicated completely, and the deep plastic front bumper and grille lost that delicate look of the Series 1. The interiors were completely upgraded, with the instrument cluster from the GTi Turbo and a redesigned centre console. The radio moved back down between the seats, and the car got a fresh new wing mirror, which would go on to be a parts bin special for all sorts of cars, including Jaguar's XJ220. Anti-lock braking became widely available throughout the range. Grace Jones was again used to advertise the new CX. In 1987, the 1 millionth CX came off the production line in Aulnay. By this stage, the XM was almost ready for production, and the CX's days were numbered, in Berlin form at least. The last saloons were sold in 1989. The brake soldiered on until 1991, while the XM estate was finalised, but only a few hundred cars were sold that year. The CX had the tall order of replacing a piece of French iconography, a car that was equal parts beautiful and innovative. It was never going to usurp the DS, nor capture the same excitement and imagination that that car had done in 1955. The world was a different place by the early 1970s. In any case, the technology wasn't different, and that's a testament to the DS and Mage's hydraulic system more than anything else. Certainly in terms of raw looks, it's my belief that the CX proved a worthy successor. You may hear the CX called the last true Citroen. The company's sale to PSA the year after the car was launched meant that Citroen's output was gradually more conventional as the years went on. Not to say some excellent cars didn't appear under PSA, and I mean Citroens, not just the 205 and the 405. I just can't help but lament that loss of uniqueness that defined Citroen in its early years, and especially now as the company makes up a small part of the colossal, sinking, melting pot that is Stellantis. It feels as if uniqueness in any car brand is becoming scarcer on the ground. I find it very difficult to believe that we'll ever again see an auto manufacturer willing to take the risks in the name of style and innovation which Citroen set out to do in its heyday. That's not so bad for us while these special cars are still within our reach, but it is a terrible sadness for our children. All that character lost in a sea of white goods, like tears in rain.